A big hearty hello to the La Trobe University community. I'm Liam Lenten from the School of Economics, your presenter for this, the latest instalment in the VC interview series. And as the name suggests, I have with me today none other than the Vice-Chancellor, Professor John Dewar. John, thanks for joining us today in the hot seat, as it were.
Thanks, Liam.
First of all, you've been in your capacity as Vice-Chancellor at La Trobe for several months now. Mm-hmm. Can you identify, let's say, your three greatest policy challenges, and by policy I mean internal rather than decreed from Canberra,
yes,
that you've been dealing with hitherto?
Yes, of course. Well, I think the first and the biggest challenge has been charting a way forward for the Faculty of Humanities and Social Science. That's been something that has occupied a big part of my time and a lot of other people's time for obvious reasons. What we've really been trying to do there is to balance, on the one hand, the importance of that faculty to the university and in particular its contribution to our research, and sustaining the research capacity in that faculty as best we can, while at the same time bringing the faculty to a position where it can at least break even. So we've really had to draw a fine balance between the support that we give the faculty because of that importance on the one hand, and the speed at which we expect them to come into balance on the other. Because really what we're asking the rest of the university community to do is to support that faculty for a period of time. So it's called for a series of very fine judgment calls about the speed with which we expect them to come into balance and the consequences that has for staffing. And of course that's been hotly contested around the campus, as I'm sure you know. And these decisions are never easy. It's certainly not something I was looking to do in my first 6 months. But my firm belief has been and still is that we need to sort this out in the interests of the faculty itself and the university. The challenge now, I think, is to find a really compelling way forward for the faculty that will be attractive to students, both current and future, and which the staff can really get behind, and that's now the Dean's priority. So I think that would be number one. Number two, I think, would be the whole question of the regional TAFE issue, which again was something that really hit us in the middle of the year, or around about May actually, when it became clear that the state government's funding of TAFEs in Victoria was going to be changed quite dramatically in a way that led some to query the future financial viability of TAFE institutes in the state, particularly those in the regions. And of course we're co-located at each of our regional campuses with a TAFE. So the question became really pressing for us, was really, what's the nature of our partnership with those institutes going to be? Because if we don't become a really close partner with them, it's very likely that they will look for partnerships with other universities. The last thing we want is essentially for a university campus to pop up on the campus of a co-located TAFE. That would be a disaster. So we've been working really hard over the last few months to figure out the right way forward, and that's still in discussion, but I'm hoping that we'll have a solution to that by the end of the year. But it's very complicated because it revolves around state and federal government policy, but within that we need to be clear about what we want. So that would be number two. And I think number three would be, and this has been more fun in a way, but just as challenging, and that's identifying the right strategy for the university. And as you know, and others will know, we've been in consultation around the World Ready document. I've been really pleased with the engagement that we've had from across the university with that. We've had over 100 submissions, which are now available in summary form on the website. The challenge now is to take all of that and convert it into a strategic plan that will really set the university in good stead for the next 5 or so years. It's pretty ambitious, and the challenge is not just to get the plan right, but to make sure that we get the implementation of all that will be needed to be done in order to achieve the plan in place. So those are the big three, I'd say, Liam.
Okay, well, I have a further question about World Ready, or one that's related to World Ready a little bit later on. But for now, on another immense policy challenge, the progression from the workload management system towards the revised university workload framework is now gathering pace. Now, from my involvement thus far, and from the limited amount of what many of us know to be the case during the consultation process, there are certain aspects about it that do worry me somewhat. So can you help us better understand what has motivated some of these revisions?
Yes. Well, the decision to modify the way we approach workloads was taken following an external review we commissioned of the workload management system. When I took over in January, it became clear that all was not well with that system for a whole range of reasons, partly to do with technical implementation and partly to do with buy-in from around the university. So we hired Andrew Lister, who's a very experienced former dean from Queensland Uni, to come and look at the way the system had been operating up to that point. And he came back with some very clear recommendations about what needed to be done. The main problems with the system as he saw it, and as he advised us very clearly, were really that it was leading to undesirable outcomes, really. That people, because of the way the system counted hours of work or units of work in quite a lot of detail, his advice was that it was leading people to behave in ways that the system was not intended to drive. In other words, people were sort of arguing over the detail of particular types of work and what they counted for in the workload, rather than responding in the way that had been hoped, which was really to give people greater clarity about performance expectations in different domains of academic work. So he was saying to us clearly that it was leading to a kind of dysfunctional behaviour, really. And his other advice was that we were trying to do too much with it. In other words, we were trying to get a lot of data out of the system to do with how people spend their time, that we would then use better to inform decisions about cost allocations and reporting of the costs of various forms of activity, particularly running subjects and degrees. And it turns out that we actually didn't need the workload management system to get all of that data. There are other ways in which we can get it. But it did mean that we over-engineered it to the extent that, again, partly drove all of the dysfunctional behaviour that was associated with it. So his advice was just to simplify it, retain the principle that, as we have agreed in any case in our enterprise bargaining agreement, that there will be an overall limit to the amount of work we expect staff to do. But within that, that there is flexibility as to the allocation of work, particularly around teaching and research. But his advice was that there were much simpler ways in which we could do that. So that's the advice to which we're now responding in the process that you've just referred to.
Right. So out of those recommendations, does that perhaps bring to light the problems of any process whereby, especially with respect to, let's say, research, so this is much more of an acute problem for academic staff rather than general staff, right? But that it's a problem of what happens when administrators attempt to put numbers to stuff, that with reference to, let's say, the ERA journal rankings by the ARC, we had wave upon wave of revisions to the system, and then ultimately they were euthanised. That this is just an inherent problem with attempting to quantify things that are inherently very difficult to quantify?
Look, I think there are two slightly different issues here. One is about how fairly to allocate work. And I think that can be done within a framework of general principle that makes clear to everyone what the expectations of performance are in areas of research and teaching, and what the consequences of those will be for workloads. So I think that is, and you may be right, that the attempt to specify in great detail the value that different forms of research activity had, for example, was probably mistaken, and that was the strong advice from the review. Whether it's wise to try and quantify research activity more generally, I think there are ways of measuring it. They vary by discipline, and there's you can have greater confidence in research-related data in some disciplines than others, just because of the different conventions around things like citations and impact factors and H factors and all of that. Whether we like it or not, the outside world does quantify things like research impact and research performance. Now, that shouldn't drive everything we do, but we have to keep an eye on it and make sure that we are performing as well as we can on those measures, as well as others that we might choose for ourselves. So while I'd agree with your proposition so far as allocating work is concerned, I would be very cautious about bucketing any attempt to quantify research, because that's the world in which we live.
Okay. Well, moving now from policy challenges to policy initiatives, you recently unveiled plans to make La Trobe the sporting university.
Yes.
Now, this is, of course, of interest to me,
Yes.
immensely so, because I'm a researcher who looks at economic aspects of the sports industry. Now, as a way of demonstrating that this is not merely show, can you discuss a couple of material, hardcore initiatives to help realise this ambition?
Yes. Well, in part, the long-term investment we want to make in sport as an area of focus for the university will depend on the outcome of the strategic plan discussion that we're just having. But leaving that aside, I can point to the appointment of Mick Malthouse as a Vice-Chancellor's Fellow. Mick has done a great job while he's been here of building our connections to key sporting bodies and clubs, and he'll continue to do that. I'm very keen to use the Vice-Chancellor's Fellow concept as a way of focusing on those areas of strength that we want to develop. I get a lot of emails from staff saying, oh, we should appoint X, Y and Z as a Vice-Chancellor's Fellow. I think we need to be quite strategic about it, and I think Mick's appointment has worked really well for us in that context. Related to that, we are developing a lot of connections with sporting bodies, particularly clubs. We already have the partnership with Melbourne Heart, and we're going to use that as the basis for seeking a lot more investment in our sporting infrastructure. In fact, we're already in discussion with state and federal government together with the Heart around using our partnership as a basis for more investment in the facilities we have on campus, and I think that could be really exciting if it comes off. But we're also talking to a range of other clubs for whom we can do a lot of things in partnership, whether it's providing educational programs for their players, giving them access to the research we do that's related to their particular sport, or indeed doing things such as we did in launching the Courier Academy of Excellence. Sport can be, as you know, a great way of reaching to particular communities in ways that support not just the communities themselves, but the ambitions of the university to get those communities into the university. So I think that those are tangible examples of what we've been doing. But of course, we will, subject to the discussion around the strategic plan, we'll be looking to develop the leadership capacity and our academic strength across all aspects of sport. And one of the great things about sport is that it's not only a growing academic discipline, as you well know, but it's also a terrific way of engaging alumni with the university and reaching out to local communities in different ways. And bringing people onto our campus, actually, just to recreate and have fun.
Well, a couple of the things I think I'd like to see come out of these strategic alliances would be access to data, maybe not so much financial statements, although that could be on the table, maybe very disaggregated playing data, and maybe building a couple of real links with respect to the teams or whatever in whatever form the partners are, in terms of financial or in-kind support to help us answer the scientific questions that they themselves want answers to. Is there any sense that there is scope for that type of alliance?
Absolutely, and I think the relationship with Melbourne Heart shows what can be done. I mean, as you probably know, they've got a great interest in improving player performance, for example, and I'm sure that our sports scientists would get a lot out of working with them using their players as subjects. And I think, in a way, that the value of the Melbourne-Hart relationship is that with them we can explore what's possible and then transfer those possibilities to other partnerships. I know, for example, that there are rugby league clubs who are very interested in using our Gate Lab as a way of assessing their players from that particular point of view of their gate. So I think there are lots of opportunities, and it's a great way of profiling the university.
Now, I wish Senator Evans was also here to field this one. Nevertheless, I'm intrigued by your response.
Yeah.
Given that universities have, for a while now, through the Bradley Report and elsewhere, to increase student numbers across the board, can you foresee a day, even if not albeit during your tenure here at La Trobe, where we might actually take the purposeful strategic decision to buck the trend and plateau, or even, dare I say, decrease or contract student numbers as a deliberate strategic decision?
That's a really interesting question. So much depends on the funding environment. And you're right that Bradley and the current government policy is to encourage expansion of the sector. But the incentive to expand was already there. Because in one sense the funding we receive per student from a combination of Commonwealth support and student contribution is really not adequate to cover the actual cost of delivery, and we know from both Bradley and the Lomax Smith review of base funding that that's the case. Now, things have improved significantly under the current government, and of course they do point to significant extra public money coming into universities, but that's because the sector has expanded massively. But the dynamic of the sector at the moment is that in order to sustain your operation, you have to grow. Growth has become a drug of addiction, if you like, for the sector.
I guess that's what I'm trying to do with this question, is challenge that seemingly unquestioned notion that perpetual significant growth rates are always beautiful and always the thing that we should be striving for. Rather, isn't this a question that we should be asking of ourselves in the first instance?
Well, I don't think it's open to us under current settings to contemplate that as a strategy. And in any case, it's not one that we would want on other grounds. I mean, we do want to promote participation to higher education to those who are able to benefit from it, as does the current government policy. And that's one of the reasons why we are proposing in the paper that we do aim to grow. We're in the fastest growing population corridor in Melbourne, one of the fastest growing in the country. It's our duty, in a way, to provide educational opportunities to people in that corridor. So I think there are compelling reasons for growth anyway. But the current policy and funding settings do not favour institutions that stop growing. That's the reality. Unless they have a way of charging students more. That's also the reality. And if you look at institutions like the University of Melbourne, essentially what their no-growth strategy is premised on a capacity to charge fees to postgraduate students. Now, we will at some stage be faced with a series of choices we will have to make, I would imagine, around the balance we want to strike between public and private contribution to educational cost. Because the sector is likely to face fee deregulation after the next election, assuming that there's a coalition government return, which there may not be, of course, but if there is, that'll be a likely change in policy. In which case, every university is likely to be faced with that question. And there will be trade-offs between growth and volume as a strategy on the one hand, and quality and increased private contribution on the other. We will have to decide where we want to fit on that continuum. You asked me earlier, what are the three big internal policy questions that we have to address? If there's a big external policy question that we have to address, that's the big one, which is coming down the track possibly for 2014 and beyond.
Okay. Well, finally, the latest academic ranking of world universities was released, providing a glowing assessment of the overall Australian university system and resulting in some much needed good publicity for the overall sector. In light of this, Do you think that we could be doing more, and if so, what, to better tell our story, as it were, to really give the impression to the broader community that they are indeed getting good bang for their taxpayer buck on university expenditure?
Yes, I think we could do a better job, and you're absolutely right that the release of the latest rankings told a terrific story about the success and global competitiveness of the Australian sector, in spite of the fact that we have one of the lowest rates of government contribution to the sector as a proportion of GDP amongst OECD countries. So I think the community and the government gets a magnificent return for its investment in universities. I think the big issue now is how that flows through into research funding policy in the sector. There is a lot of pressure on government to focus research funding on a few elite universities in order to promote them even further up the international rankings. My view is that the government would be wiser to look at the next cohort of universities, of which we are one, who are also in the global rankings but currently lower down, because I think we're the next wave. We're the next group of universities that will start powering up the rankings if we get our policy settings right. You can imagine the contestation that will take place within the sector and between the sector and government based on these kinds of data in terms of where investments should be made in the future. But I think you're right. I think the sector has a great story to tell and could probably do a better job than it does, but has started to do a better job, particularly in the last couple of years when there's been a change of leadership at Universities Australia.
Well, John, as enlightening as it has been, we must leave it there. Thank you once again for your participation.
Thanks, no worries. Thank you.
And thank you too for watching. Make sure you join us for the next instalment of this interview series, where the interviewer will be Jennifer Webb, Charles La Trobe University Research Fellow in Archaeology. And until then, from me, Liam Lenten, farewell for now.